Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Outlook for Federally Owned and Leased Real Estate under the Biden Administration, presented by the Yale International Center for Finance and the Yale Alumni Real Estate Association. My name is Curtis Sano of Holland and Knight, Berkeley 88, and I am your host for today. The International Center for Finance, or ICF, provides academic and professional support for research in financial economics. The Yale Alumni Real Estate Association is a national association of Yale alumni who share an interest, whether professional or personal, in commercial real estate. The ICF is partnering with the Yale Alumni Real Estate Association to host a series of webinars on topics of interest to the commercial real estate industry. Today's discussion is the first in that series. Norman Dong of FD Stonewater, Trumbull 88, and Bob Peck of Gensler, Law 72, are joining us today to talk about current topics as they affect the federal government's owned and leased real estate as the new Biden administration takes shape. Each of them served as the commissioner of the GSA Public Building Service. Before we start, if you have any questions, please type in your question using the Q&A button below at any time. We will try to cover as many of these questions as we can at the end of the presentation. In addition, for those of you who submitted questions in advance, our speakers will try to weave answers to those questions into their discussion today. If we don't get to your question, our panelists will try to put together a sheet of answers to some of the questions to be distributed to the attendees of today's webinar. So to kick things off, Bob and Norm, you're both very passionate about federal real estate. Can you each share a story about how you first became hooked on federal real estate?
Well, I'm the senior guy. I'll go first. Interestingly, when I came to law school, I was already interested in cities and design, and I thought I was going to get a joint degree in law and city planning. I decided not to do that, but I found out that Professor Vincent Scully, the late lamented and great professor of architectural history, taught his undergraduate course, I think it was 153B, History of Art, 153B, in the law school auditorium. I wasn't really thrilled with my law school classes, and so I started auditing his classes. The law school, I found, was willing to give me credit for taking the course, so long as I figured out a way that this had something to do with law. I proposed, since I grew up in Washington, D.C., a paper about federal government architecture in the 20th century in Washington, D.C. The law school, God knows why, bought into it. And I discovered in the course of that, in my research one night in the law library, that there was this position called Commissioner of Public Buildings at GSA. And I remember thinking, that would be a cool job. That was the beginning of my interest, and I was fortunate 20 some years later actually to get the job.
Oh, Bob, I never knew that. I also took Scully's course, but it took me a lot longer to get interested in the world of real estate. And for those of you who know me, I actually started my career not in real estate, but in government finance, whether it was when I was working in Connecticut or DC government or as the CFO of FEMA. And I wasn't really focused on government real estate until about 2011, when I was at FEMA and we were facing a significant budget shortfall. And we were faced with the prospect of having to reduce staff. So no federal agency wants to be in the position of having to cut staff, particularly at a place like FEMA, where your ability to respond to or recover from disasters like what we recently saw in the state of Texas, it's all about kind of your bench strength and your staffing. So we looked at other ways to address our budget shortfall, and we looked at where we were spending our money. Not surprisingly, salaries and expenses was the #1 line item in terms of our spending, but real estate was right behind it. So we knew we had to do something. Back in 2011, Bob Peck was at GSA, and I've known Bob, God, for almost 30 years now. So I reached out to Bob and his team at GSA, and they helped us look at how we were spending our money and how we were using our real estate, particularly here in DC, where we had 11 different locations for FEMA. And Bob and his team came up with some very thoughtful, practical recommendations on how FEMA could reduce its footprint, co-locate, consolidate, and save more than $10 million in annual rent costs. And that's just here in DC. So through that experience, that really resonated with me. And I saw that at FEMA, that helped us avoid painful staff reductions. And what you've seen is back in 2011, there were 11 different lease locations. Today at FEMA, there's one. So it really kind of illustrates kind of like the size and the scale of the reduction that that agency was able to achieve and the savings that it was able to redirect towards more mission critical activities. So the headline for me after all of that was all about being able to manage your real estate portfolio more effectively. And it showed me how, okay, excess spending on real estate often comes at the expense of more mission critical requirements.
You know, to put that in context a little bit, I mean, Norm basically came to us at GSA and said, do your job. You're supposed to be the government's landlord. You're supposed to help us figure this stuff out. And it's one of the great things about the job, because GSA does kind of run like a business. The Public Building Service collects rents from federal agencies. It's supposed to use the revenues from rents to run its operations and to make capital expenditures. So it's a great job. I will tell you one little anecdote. When I was at GSA the first time under President Clinton, who was in law school same time I was, we went to dedicate a new headquarters for the Secret Service. And he turned to me and he said, you know, man, you got a pretty good job here. The government's landlord, it's a big deal. I said, it's a great job unless you think about that Eddie Murphy skit in Saturday Night Live in which he's in jail and he's just keeps saying over and over, I'm going to kill my landlord. So, you know, it's a big inventory. Sometimes people like Norm think you're good. Sometimes people aren't so happy.
All right, thanks, guys. So for our first topic today, let's talk about the impact of COVID on federal real estate. Norm and Bob, COVID-19 has had a significant impact on the commercial office and retail market. What impacts have you been seeing on the willingness of private owners to make deals with GSA and the other federal agencies?
All right, so I was a history major at Yale, so we're going to kind of look at the historical context here. Why don't we pull up that first slide? And what we want to be able to do is first consider how these types of major events or external shocks to the system have impacted federal real estate in the past. And this chart, I think, helps provide some historical context. And let me just take a minute to explain what you're looking at. This tracks federal leasing activity since 2000. The blue bars that you see represent the nationwide lease portfolio for GSA, and the blue line more specifically looks at the GSA lease portfolio here in the national capital region. And you clearly see a pattern after these major historical events, whether we're talking about the events of September 11th or after the financial collapse of 2008, 2009. And after each of these shocks to the system, you first saw a massive increase in federal spending to respond to the crisis. So take September 11th. Right after that, you saw the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security. You also saw how Homeland or security, national security spending, including Department of Defense, FBI, and other agencies, significantly expanded their activity to prevent future terrorist activity. So after 9/11, funding for federal Homeland Security activities at DHS and other agencies, it increased from $16 billion in 2001 to almost $70 billion 10 years later, an increase of more than 300%. As you look further out on the timeline, you see a similar pattern of increased federal spending after the financial collapse of 2008 and 2009. In this instance, you saw a massive infusion of federal spending to jumpstart the economy. And after a recession hit, federal spending increased to a record 24% of GDP. So what you're seeing is when you have these external shocks to the system, first, you see the increase in federal spending, But as federal spending increases, so does the federal real estate. And that's what this chart is trying to show. Take a look at the graph. You see that sharp uptick after 2011 in the GSA leased inventory, and you see it again after 2009. So the question is, all right, as COVID hits, are we going to see a similar pattern afterwards? When the pandemic hit last year, we saw history begin to repeat itself, at least in terms of federal spending. There was that first stimulus bill, the CARES Act, with its $2 trillion price tag, and that was designed to provide much needed economic relief to individuals and families facing hardship. But at the same time, it wasn't just aid to individuals and families. It was an infusion of cash and spending among federal agencies who were charged with the response to the pandemic. So let's just put up this next chart for a second. And this shows, all right, last year with the CARES Act, you had another $340 billion being pumped into these federal agencies. Not surprisingly, this green wedge, the $140 billion, is the Department of Health and Human Services. That is home to CDC and NIH and other agencies within HHS that are on the front lines of the pandemic response. But you also see other federal agencies getting infusions of funding as well, whether it's departments of education or transportation or HUD. And you may not have realized that those agencies also have a role in the response effort. So as you see these massive infusions of federal funding, are you going to see an increased demand for federal real estate? And, will history repeat itself as we saw in the past? But Bob, I know that you've been looking at this question as well. You have your own thoughts and perspectives in terms of where things may be going. I'm going to toss the ball to you.
Yeah, thanks, Norm. The other side of this, Norm's in part talking about the supply side, if money is a supply. The demand side, which is a big question mark, and let's just put that on the table now, is what does demand for real estate look like? And not just in the federal government. At Gensler, we work with private sector and public sector clients, building out their spaces, building new buildings. And right now, the big question for everyone is, well, most everyone in these organizations in the government and elsewhere have been working from home. And to what extent are people going to come back? And when they come back, will they come back in the same numbers? Will they have the same requirements of square feet per person that people had before? Every other time when we've had a recovery, as Norm's noting, people have come back and said, okay, I squeezed my space a little bit, but I'm coming back. So let's talk about a couple of trends. One, for the last 8, 9, 10 years, the federal government has been reducing square footage per person anyway, in recognition of the fact that the more open environment is more of the trend in office space to encourage collaboration and problem solving and all of those kinds of things. And by the same token, people looking at the amount of money it costs to build out space, and the fact that even before the pandemic, people were mobile, if not so mobile working from home, mobile in their own workspace where they don't spend all day at a desk. They might be working in a cafe or working in some conference room with other people. So square footage was going down. To go back to the question in the pandemic, are people coming back? Well, we don't know because people aren't fully back yet, or the pandemic isn't over clearly. But we've done some survey work at Gensler that shows that in general, people expect, the vast majority of people are looking forward to working from home. And the largest number of people are looking to work from home 2 to 3 days a week. There's hardly anybody who wants to work from home all the time. Our numbers in almost every industry hover around 13 to 15%. Number of people who want to come back full-time is actually higher in the federal government than elsewhere. It's around 30%. And on the bubble in between are people who want to work part-time from someplace else. Running counter to that, however, our surveys also show that at the moment, if you say well, given the fact that you're not going to be in the office all the time, how about if you share a desk with someone else? That would reduce our square footage significantly. People are saying, I'm not about to do that either. And if the choice is staying home or coming back to work, people are actually saying, I'd rather come back to work and claim a seat than I would share. I think that may change as people get more used to the pandemic being over, to the fact that we can do deep cleaning in offices overnight if you're sharing a workstation or an office. So we'll see. The one thing that we do know is people crave coming back to work, whether it's because they think that problem solving gets done better, whether because we are, after all, social animals, or because, as our survey results also show, people sort of miss the mentoring that happens, the exchange of institutional information that happens when you're in the office. So it may be we come back to the office, there may be some sharing of desks, there may be a little more room between them to create some social distance. Net, that could be that we're at about the same square footage per person, could be that we're a little smaller. Hard to know, which is going to raise some questions for portfolio managers and is raising questions in the real estate market about how long a term do I want to go into on my next lease or my next occupancy agreement, as they call it in the government, because I'm not sure how much space I'm going to need.
Yeah, to that point, you know, Bob and I, over the past 10 years, the mantra within the federal government has been go for that longer term to lock in on favorable leasing rates in many markets. I'm not sure that can be the mantra anymore. Given all of the uncertainty that we're facing, I think it really brings that strategy and that back into question in terms of, is that the right strategy going forward?
Yeah, and you know, and to go back to what you were saying about FEMA 10, 11 years ago, Norm, the mantra has also been, let's consolidate space as much as we can. To the extent we have the government's owned inventory, which is not insignificant in GSA, it's about 175, 180 million square feet of space. Let's renovate that space, bring people into it because we've got a sunk investment in it. And if the buildings are at all efficient, let's reuse them. For sustainability purposes, better to use existing real estate than to build new. It raises questions about that too. How much space do I need if I consolidate into it? One reason that we saw some leasing going up before in the federal government was, in some ways, it was easier to get the funding to move into a new leasehold and have the landlord help you finance the renovations you need to move into a new kind of work environment than to get it in a federal building. All of those things, I think at the moment, and Norm and I have both talked to career people in GSA who are grappling with this question at the moment. Go back to my demand thing. If you don't really know how much space you're going to need, do you make long-term decisions right now? And I think the answer is we're going to see a little bit of a hold and a willingness to take shorter-term leases, shorter-term occupancy agreements for a while, and let this all shake out. And hopefully a year from now, we'll know a lot more about long-term needs.
All right, thanks, Bob. Now that President Biden has taken office, we know that the new political leadership is not yet in place. So there are a couple of issues that are already changing with the new administration, two of them being sustainability and building standards. Bob, can you outline the Biden administration's approach to addressing climate change and promoting sustainability? And how will this approach play out over the next few years on its activities regarding federal real estate?
Yeah, well, Curtis, you're right. There's not, obviously they haven't had a chance in GSA particularly to even appoint the permanent leadership and to change policies. But I think there are a couple of telltale signs. One, let's go back to COVID. President Biden, I believe his first day, issued an executive order mandating the use of wearing masks in federal facilities. So there's an indication that in the administration, the federal building inventory is going to be seen as a model to provide leadership in other aspects of society. I think it's pretty clear that that will happen with respect to sustainability as well, because clearly this administration is back to talking about climate change, sustainability, and resilience as a factor that's going to underlie a lot of policies in a lot of different areas. And I think when you look at the GSA inventory, the military real estate inventory, those are obvious places where the administration can take a leadership role in the building industry, which we know accounts for something like 40% of greenhouse gas emissions in general. And there's an opportunity to take the federal government, which, by the way, has had a leadership role in energy conservation since the Arab oil embargo of the 70s. GSA buildings were almost completely outfitted with motion sensors for lighting long before other people did it. The GSA buildings have pretty advanced HVAC controls. I think you're going to see a big emphasis on new sustainability standards in federal buildings. New buildings already require LEED Gold. I think another area that we ought to expect changes in is in the leased inventory, because as Norman showed, I mean, something like 50% of the GSA inventory is in leased space. There have been green clauses in GSA leases for quite some time now. And I think we can expect to see the standards of the lease clauses in terms of sustainability and resilience torquing up quite a bit. One other thing I'll just note that may have to do with location policy as well. GSA's all for a long time has been reluctant to see anything built or leased in a floodplain. The definition of a floodplain, the map boundaries are changing, and I think we're going to see some concern about that kind of resilience and resilience to weather effects as well. So just some things to keep an eye on. One other thing I'll note is that GSA and the Obama administration, we began a program at GSA called the Green Proving Ground, in which we said not only are we going to have like normal building standards, we set aside some money to begin beta testing new technologies. I think there's an opportunity there too to see whether some of the new, whether it's solar, photovoltaic, geothermal, can be applied to federal buildings, and that too could be a sort of a technology transfer for the private sector.
Thanks, Bob. In December, then President Trump signed an executive order stating that classical architecture should be the preferred and default style of all federal buildings going forward. Can you talk about the guiding principles that have informed the federal approach to design for decades, and why this recent executive order is generating so much backlash?
Yeah, I thought that was, it was interesting that the administration took hold of that so quickly, because architectural style is not something that characterizes debate in too many administrations. Washington and Jefferson talked about style and did think the classical was an appropriate style for the American government. Although I'll just note that at the time it was also the fad. So it's not like they were reaching back to Greece and Rome, but it was also a contemporary style. In the interest of full disclosure, I used to work for the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan of New York, who wrote the guiding principles of federal architecture for President Kennedy, that said that federal architecture should not impose an official style. In part, by the way, that was a reaction. People then were World War II vets. They'd known that Hitler's Germany had imposed a standard. Happened to be, by the way, to be fair, the federal government was building neoclassical buildings in the 30s. So were the fascists. It was kind of a universal government style. But by the 60s, there was really a feeling that federal government architecture was living in the past and ought to catch up to contemporary architecture. Starting in the 90s, GSA began a design excellence program, really sort of taking that to heart and getting the best of American buildings. And so why don't we go to the next slide? And there's controversy over the sorts of buildings that have been produced. I happen to love them, other people don't. This is the federal courthouse in Eugene, Oregon by Tom Main of Morphosis, and it's a the courtrooms inside is a wonderfully functional building. It does tell you it's a public building. And you can see to the left, it has a grand staircase, but obviously in a very, very modern idiom. And if you look at the next building, which is often critiqued by the classical advocates, this is the new federal courthouse in Los Angeles, recipient of a National American Institute of Architects Award. A great glass cube. The picture doesn't quite do it justice because the faceted facade is really beautiful when you get in there, and there's a beautiful interior as well. Next, but what people want a little, some people would rather see, and this is a contemporary building built within the last, Norm, you always correct me on this, I think it's within the last 10 years.
Oh yeah, this one I think was complete probably within the past 3 years. I remember being at the groundbreaking for this one.
And next, the next slide, and this one even more authentic in a sort of a Greek temple style. You know, I always revert to a quote from from Senator Moynihan, who used to say, you know, there are certain things we preserve because we just don't do them well anymore, but we should not preserve out of a sense that we have been outthought by the past. And so I think in the American architectural community, the idea of the federal government saying that every building should look like a Greek or Roman temple is just sort of a thumb in the eye of history, not to mention style. Make a long story short, the Biden administration rescinded the executive order. It had gone, at one point that executive order was going to be called Make America Beautiful Again. And in architectural circles, people are happy to go back to, let's get the best of contemporary American architecture. There's certainly room also for historical styles to be brought in. Personally, I'd rather see them brought in with a sort of a modern touch to them. But we're kind of back to the design excellence program now, and I think the argument's been put to bed for at least a little while.
Hey, let me jump in here as well. And I'm going to actually relate this back to your original question, Curtis, in terms of how each of us got hooked on federal real estate. And yeah, I kind of shared the experience at FEMA. But beyond that, I think I kind of got hooked even further when I was at GSA and had the opportunity to support the Design Excellence Program. And you've heard Bob talk about that. But it really resonated with me in terms of the integrity of that process. And it was not about asserting preference for one architectural style over another, but again, it was about the discipline of the process. One of the things about the Design Excellence Program is the peer review process that brings together leading thinkers in the various fields of design and construction and landscape architecture to weigh in on the proposed design concept for a particular project. And I think Bob and I would both agree that you get a much better product at the back end when you have that type of peer review among the leading thinkers in the field. And I think the approach recognizes how form should follow function here, and how the proposed design for any federal building really needs to consider and relate to the natural and the built environment surrounding it. So for me, when I was at GSA, and supporting the Design Excellence Program, it was all about how we ensure that we're putting our best foot forward as a federal government, and ensuring at how the quality and the design of the design and the construction of our federal buildings, whether we're talking about courthouses, land ports of entry, or research facilities, reflects the importance of the work taking place within these buildings.
Yeah, Norm, I'm glad you said that, because we can get caught up too much in the style. And the issue is that these buildings are there for a long time. They represent the federal government in their community, have for a long time. In the 19th century, you built a courthouse or a federal building or a post office, and it would literally put a town on the map. There's this wonderful photo from 1906 of the stone federal building in Cheyenne, Wyoming. The streets are dirt, the sidewalks are wooden, and there's a solid building representing, the tie of this far-flung place. to the country. And you know, when I first came to GSA in the 90s, unfortunately, federal architecture since World War II had become so mediocre that, you know, we would build a building in town and it would often sometimes be a laughing stock because it was out of scale, made out of different materials and everything around it. But it didn't generate development and it didn't generate respect. And let's just go to internally. You walk into a building where your heart sinks when you walk in the door because it's, you know, gloomy and not filled with light. It affects the way you work. So both on behalf of the American citizens who pay for these things and the people who work inside, it's important to do the architecture right and to look like you're part of a 21st century world to the extent you can make that happen.
All right, thanks, Norm and Bob. Norm, over the past decade, the federal government has initiated a number of large-scale headquarters projects, including DHS at St. Elizabeth's, the FBI headquarters consolidation, and the renovation of the Herbert Hoover building for the Department of Commerce. But despite years of effort and hundreds, if not billions of dollars being spent, none of these projects has yet crossed the finish line. And the FBI project hasn't even gotten out of the gate yet. Do you see any of these large-scale projects actually getting done over the next few years, or will they continue to languish?
It's been really difficult. You mentioned some examples, including DHS. Let's talk more specifically about DHS as an example. The master plan for the DHS headquarters consolidation, I believe, was approved back in 2009. Coast Guard was one of the first components on the campus when it took occupancy of the Monroe building back in 2013. 6 years later, the DHS Secretary's office finally got there in April of 2019. So you've got other components like CBP or ICE that have yet to be consolidated onto the campus, and other components like FEMA and TSA and CIS that are going to be remaining in lease space under long-term leases. So as funding continues to lag, we've seen the DHS headquarters consolidation being scaled back considerably, and the completion schedule continually shifting to the right. DHS is one example. You mentioned how FBI isn't even out of the starting gate yet, and the Department of Commerce modernization, that movie has been playing for a long time. So these projects are dragging on for a long time, and largely because Congress has not appropriated the amounts that GSA and others have been requesting to complete these projects. And I'll just share a data point. When you look at GSA's capital budget, traditionally it's been underfunded significantly. We've seen that pattern over the past decade. In 2021, the fiscal year that we're currently in, GSA had originally requested something north of $2 billion in terms of its capital budget requests. Congress ultimately approved 39% of that original request. We've seen that pattern play out every year for more than a decade. So my question is, all right, do you keep repeating this practice of request and rejection year after year? Or do you start thinking about an alternative approach? And I think we're at a point now where we need to think about what plan B is.
Yeah, and I say, you know, Norm mentions that Congress doesn't appropriate the funds. Go back to what I said originally about how GSA works. One of the ironies here is that GSA over the last 20 years has gotten really good at producing a profit every year, a net income, which is put in a fund, the Federal Buildings Fund, which is supposed to fund capital expenditures. As I noted, the fund has billions and billions of dollars in it, but Congress won't appropriate the funds from it because I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but it counts as federal spending, even though it's already been accumulated in a fund. So that's not working. And, you know, one of the things that discourages people about government and undermines confidence is when you suggest something like the St. E's development for Homeland Security, and you say it's going to cost X amount of dollars. You don't appropriate the funds, you stretch out the schedule, when you finally come back to Congress and you say 8 years later, well, now I need another $1 billion to build that because costs have gone up. They're very unhappy with you. How come you didn't hold to your original budget? And it's really a huge mistake. But as Norm and I have discussed several times, it raises the question, should the government lay out these large projects in this way, or is there a better way to do it? Should we be more realistic? The last time I testified on Homeland Security and SANES in 2012, I had an argument with the people who had to review my testimony about whether I could say the project has been delayed or only stretched out. And I was talking about a stretch out at that point of about 6 to 8 years. And I said, sounds like a delay to me, but I wasn't allowed to say that.
All right, thanks. Norm, historically, the federal government has been extremely sluggish in identifying and disposing of underutilized assets. Today, there's a federal buildings reform board established under statute that is now taking a more focused effort to identify and dispose of underutilized assets. Can you provide some perspective on the challenges and obstacles the government faces in disposing of underutilized federal assets, and what do you recommend going forward?
All right, Curtis, as you said, historically, there's been a general reluctance to shed vacant and underutilized federal properties. And I think it's been true for a variety of reasons. They include speculation about a future potential need, optimism about future funding to modernize these buildings, even though I think that optimism is sometimes misplaced given the capital budgeting pattern that we just talked about, or the lack of a strong incentive to dispose of the asset. And when I was at GSA, and I'm sure that Bob would have a similar perspective, I think the government asked the wrong question. The government would ask, is the facility in use? And if the answer was yes, the default would be to keep it in the portfolio, regardless of its development potential, regardless of its capital repair needs, or regardless of other options to satisfy and address the tenant agency space requirement. And what we saw historically was that only in the absence of a program need would folks consider the notion of disposing of the asset. So it was historically a portfolio strategy, often driven by the need to kind of get rid of the junk that you're not using, as opposed to really looking at that question of highest and best use. I would say that, over time, the government has gotten better in terms of asking the more relevant questions. I think there's some examples that we've seen, examples during my tenure at GSA, where I think we've made considerable progress in our thinking. Some of the projects that we worked on was the outlease of the historic Dyer Courthouse in Miami, the disposition of the Cotton Annex here in Washington, and a project that Bob will talk about in a minute, and that is the exchange of the VOLPE campus in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But let me add one thing before I toss it over to Bob, and that is, there's a lot of complaining about the complexity of the process and a recognition that, there's a lot of steps involved and it's bureaucratic. I think with those examples that I just mentioned and plenty of others, history has shown that, okay, when the government really has the fire in the belly to get something done, you can manage the process. The process isn't perfect, but it's doable. And it really kind of takes a focused effort and a clear sense of accountability and a project plan and a timeline and the discipline of managing to that plan and timeline. And when you do that, you can actually get projects across the finish line. And I think a classic example, as I mentioned, is the VOLPE campus. And since Bob and I both worked on that over our respective tenures, I'll ask Bob to tee up that conversation.
Okay. Before we do that, I want to mention one or two other things about disposals. One is, as always, the government is a political institution. There were times everyone looks at a couple of very valuable federal properties that have not been disposed of and asks why that is. Why doesn't the government pocket the money they could get from selling? I'm not going to tell you the instance, but there are one or two on which the government was trying to dispose of a property, but local political forces would rather see the property transferred without cost to a local jurisdiction. So sometimes you find yourselves hung up on, yeah, I know you don't need that. You know, we agree the federal government doesn't need the property. By all rights, it should be sold. And sometimes a local jurisdiction wants it, and they're going to flip it into a private development scheme and take the money. So we've seen that as well. One other thing I'll just note is that, you know, there are I love historic buildings. You can probably not to redo them now, but I love the fact that a quarter of the federal inventory is historic. Some of those buildings are beyond, as Norm notes, their highest and best use is something other than as a federal office building. One ironic to me example of that is the old post office in Washington, which became the Trump Hotel. Didn't work as an office building. Everyone who looked at it said this should be a hotel. There are other federal buildings that should remain in the inventory, even if they're not the most efficient buildings that you can imagine, because they're important landmarks. And if they can be made to work well, which is often the case in historic buildings, you know, they can serve a dual purpose. But Norm notes a really good example. It's also a cautionary tale. So let's go to the next slide. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, the federal government owns a property called the VOLPE Center. It's part of the Department of Transportation, does terrific research of all kinds. And the blue outline you see here is the outline of the property. It's sort of a little hard to tell, but at the bottom of the screen in the center, you can see a 17-story building. That's the current VOLPE Center. And the rest of the property, as you can see, in the middle of Cambridge, Massachusetts, surrounded by very valuable commercial real estate and right near MIT, is pretty much vacant property. Here was an opportunity for the federal government to declare that while the government still had a need for a facility on the site, we didn't need all of that acreage. And so the deal that GSA struck, I think Norm gets credit for putting this thing out on the street, was a deal in which we said to developers, if you can build us a replacement facility on the site, and you imagine what they're going to do, and they are doing, is to put it off to a side, you can develop the rest of the site. Fortunately, the city of Cambridge was also interested in having the site developed. So in return for building the government a new 400,000 square foot building, you get the right to develop over 1 million square feet of other property on the site. This is given the constraints there are legally and in regulation for all kinds of creative deals you would love to do in the federal government, but can't. This is one that you can do because the property exchanges are allowed. The reason I mentioned it's a cautionary tale is that the government tried the same thing to get a new FBI headquarters outside of Washington, D.C. And in that case, the value of the asset we have in hand, the J. Edgar Hoover FBI building on Pennsylvania Avenue, doesn't quite come up to the value that you need to pay for a new replacement facility. And GSA and the Congress between them took a long time getting around to that realization. And in the end, that deal didn't work. VOLPE, however, just have to say, fortunately for the government, MIT, which really wanted their hands on this property, paid a good price for the property. And it's, I think it works out to the benefit of everyone.
Yeah, let me just pick up on what Bob was saying. And I think it comes back to some of the conversation before in terms of the federal government is not getting the capital budget dollars it's requesting, 39% for GSA in this fiscal year. And we've seen that pattern over and over and over. So the question is, how do you kind of rethink your portfolio strategy and your portfolio expectations to kind of reflect this budget reality? In the case of DOT, they didn't have the $250 million that they needed to construct a new facility. But what folks recognized was that the federal government was sitting on an incredibly valuable piece of property. And it was that fiscal reality of, oh, you're not going to get the budget money for this, that forced people to take a more thoughtful look in terms of how they're utilizing their assets and how they harness the underlying value of these federal assets.
Yep.
Okay. Thanks, Bob and Norm. We do have a couple of questions. The first of which is somebody asked whether they can get the chart. Are you two okay with distributing the slides to the attendee list?
Sure.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Okay. Sounds great. And the second
Curtis,
question.
I'm also I'll post the results of the Gensler surveys on Back to Work and how people are feeling about that from last fall. So it might be interesting too.
Thanks, Bob. We did actually have a question. The question is from Richard Butterworth. He asks, during the Obama administration, there was a big push for alternative energy with specific goals for spending targets. Some believe that there were some significantly uneconomic investments in order to meet those goals. During the Trump administration, there was a shift to resilience as a basis for investment and a rejection of sustainability or alternative energy investment as a goal in and of itself. Do you believe there will be a merging of those approaches, or will there be a pendulum back to the spending goals of the Obama administration during the Biden administration?
Well, not surprising that Rich, who's a GSA veteran, would ask a really good question. Can I just note one thing? Rich is probably right that some of the requirements that the government makes are uneconomic, if by that you mean there's an immediate return on investment. As always in returns, it depends on your time frame. So one other thing we should note, the Biden administration is going to require a big changeover in the federal vehicle fleet to electric vehicles. And in part, that's designed to stimulate the supply side of the market and eventually bring down prices for everybody. So it's government taking a leadership role. The government can conceivably, when I talk about the green proving ground at GSA, I was saying the same thing. We're going to take a little bit of our funding and go out on the, not the bleeding edge, but the leading edge and see how things are working. I do think, however, that by and large, the government has an obligation to the taxpayers to show that there's a reasonable return on investment on most of what it does. If it's prepared to go beyond that, I think it's important to set a goal and say, we'll take a slightly lower return in return for moving the market. But obviously that's a balancing act. I do think the short answer to Richard's question is yes, you will see a bit of the pendulum swing back toward let's try some new things that will get us into a more resilient posture in the building sector in general. Norm, you gotta.
No, I think you got it.
All right. Next question is from Ross Can. If the agencies are only being allocated 39% of their requested budget, what prevents them from doubling their request, knowing they will get cut in half?
Hey, I'll take this one, and I'm gonna geek out in terms of my federal budget background a little bit. And you've got to understand kind of the process and the constraints for federal budgeting, where you operate under these budget caps by appropriations subcommittees. So GSA is part of the Financial Services and General Government Appropriations Subcommittee, where you've got agencies like Treasury, and I believe the courts are in that. You've got all these smaller agencies. So they're all kind of like operating in this appropriations account or the subcommittee where there's a hard cap that governs it. So it's kind of like a zero-sum game. And at the end of the day, you can't exceed that cap. So if you ask for twice the amount, it's not like it's a rug merchant where you kind of start really high and then you kind of go back and forth. You're operating under that budget cap at the end of the day, and there's only so much room across those agencies that are also in that appropriation subcommittee. So that's why you're seeing the constraint. And if you ask for 2x or 4x, it's not going to make a difference.
Right. Exactly right. And to be, and just I hope this is a comfort to people within the federal government. People are honest. I mean, we're in the real estate. The federal government's in the real estate market like everybody else. You know what the numbers are. You know how many millions of square feet you have. You know what it costs to renovate that space or operate it. You can't really inflate the numbers very much. But Norm makes the more important point. Even if you do, it won't change the budget allocation that you get. So you need to present honest numbers. Norm and I both testified that you've got an inventory of X millions of square feet. Every benchmark you have tells you should be spending so much per year as a percentage of the value of that inventory in capital expenditures to keep it up. This is the number. And it happens in local state governments as well, and sometimes in private firms. People often say, I hear you, that's in the long term. In the short term, I only have so much money to spend, and suck it up. And then only when the facility is in really dire straits, do you have to go back and then spend even more money to try to maintain it at all.
Hey, I'll add one more thought real quick. And that comes back to what I said before in terms of really think it's important for the federal government to be recalibrating and rethinking its portfolio strategy, given this capital budgeting reality that we've observed for more than a decade. And I think COVID really kind of helps call the question in terms of some of these original value propositions that we have seen with some of these large scale consolidation projects and whether they still make sense going forward. And given how COVID has shown how agencies can function with a significant degree of remote work, what is the value proposition that was put forward 10 years ago about, and the mission benefit of co-locating functions in these large scale consolidation projects, is that still valid? And at what cost? And one of the things we haven't talked about is, okay, what's the payback period that we would expect for these large scale federal construction projects? And I think there needs to be some more conversation about that in terms of, all right, you should be applying a clear yardstick. State of Washington, for example, uses a clear 20-year payback period to decide whether to own or lease a facility. One last question in terms of this issue of owning versus leasing. We've talked about how the capital budget request has been significantly underfunded year after year. It's a very different story in terms of the rental of space account, which pays for all of the GSA leases. Congress views that as a must pay. So that pretty much comes in at 100% of request every year.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because whatever most people on this call are probably at least as good or better than we are at portfolio strategy. Whatever portfolio strategy you have in terms of theoretically how much of my space should I own, which functions are going to be going on for 100 years, so they ought to be in an owned space versus ones that are going to move or change, and so they could be in lease space. Whatever you say about that, what Norm just said sort of really overrides all of those considerations. If I'm an agency in an aging federal building, and I go to GSA and say, when are you going to fix this thing up? And GSA says, we've been asking for 10 years and we can't get the money through Congress. At some point you say, well, there's a brand new Class A building that just got put up down the street and it's half vacant and it's got enough space to accommodate us, put us in a lease. And as Norm notes, leases, even if you sign a 10-year lease in any given year, that's an obligation of the government that Congress understands it doesn't have much of a choice about fulfilling. And if that lease is $25 million a year versus $100 million to fix up the building that agency is, or it drives everybody towards a lease. Not necessarily bad for many of the people on this call who represent owners, but as a portfolio manager, you'd like to have a little bit of leverage in the other direction as well.
Thanks, Norman and Bob. We have another question. This one is from Jaime Reyes, and it's talking about the National Capital Region real estate market and federal government leasing in the next 5 years or so. I could see from your chart that it looked like the share of DC Capital lease real estate was going down as a percentage of the total. How do you see the market as to where it's going in this area?
Well,
Bob, you
first of all,
want to go first?
first of all, I should say that the numbers on Norm's chart are the lease inventory, the national lease inventory versus the National Capital Region leased inventory. But it's also true, I believe, that as a percentage of the inventory in the National Capital Region, the lease square footage has gone down. And so as a percentage of the overall inventory, it's also gone down. Boy, go back to the whole question about how much square footage are we going to need overall in the next 5 years? Is it going to be the same, less because of more people working from home, or what's the overall need going to be? And then we could start to parse out how much of that's going to be satisfied by leases versus owned space.
Yeah, I think we saw high vacancy rates here in the National Capital Region prior to COVID, right? I think the pandemic has only made things worse.
You mean the real estate?
Take a while for this to shake out.
Yeah, real estate in general, law firms are taking less space. And I should just note, we talked before about when are people going to make decisions. An awful lot of private sector tenants are kicking the can down the road and saying, I am not signing a brand new, a long-term extension. So we'll see. There is, and as Norm noted, the office vacancy rate was going up, partly because people were recognizing they needed less square footage per person. So that's going to be something important to follow overall in the next couple of years.
All right, thanks, guys. So that seems to be it for the questions. So thank you all, and thank you to the audience for joining us. Please join us for the next webinar in our series, which will be on Wednesday, March 10 at 12:30 p.m. The panel will share their perspective on the current status of small and emerging managers in the private equity real estate investment space. So thanks again to Bob and Norm for sharing your perspectives on federal real estate, and look forward to seeing everyone again in next week. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.